Hello, hello. Welcome back to No Me Callo. I won't stay quiet. I'm your host, Lomelin. And before I say anything else, I want to invite you to do something with me. Take a deep breath. Inhale slowly. Exhale. Because so often we live rushing from one place to another, from one responsibility to the next, from one emotion to another, without really stopping to feel where we are. And maybe today you're listening to this episode because something inside of you needed a pause. Or maybe you don't exactly know what you're looking for. Maybe you just know that something inside of you is changing. Or maybe you're in a moment in your life where many things have ended and you still don't know what comes next. If that's the case, I want you to know this space is for you. This episode isn't just a conversation, it's an invitation. An invitation to pause for a moment and look inward. During February, we talked about love, about what it really means to love, about what it means to open your heart, and about what it means to trust. But we also talked about something we often avoid recognizing, that sometimes loving also means letting go. Because there are moments in life when we realize that something that once mattered, something that was real, something that may have even been beautiful, can no longer continue in the same place in our story. And then that difficult moment arrives, the moment of letting go. And so March arrives with something completely new. After a February of releasing, crying, questioning, and letting go of what no longer had place in our lives, it's time to open our eyes and take a deep breath. This month on the podcast, we begin a series that goes beyond stories about love. It's a series that isn't about other people. It's about you. It's about what happens when you decide to look at yourself with honesty. It's about what happens when you choose to rebuild yourself from the inside out. So this new series is called Bloom, Rising Within. And I want you to pause for a moment on that word, bloom. Because blooming doesn't mean becoming someone completely different. Blooming means something much deeper. It means allowing what has always been inside of you to finally have the space to grow. So the first episode of this series is Rising from Silence. Letting go doesn't always look strong from the outside. Letting go often happens in silence, in a conversation that changes everything, in a decision made with a broken heart, in a night when we finally accept the truth we had been avoiding for a long time. And when we finally let go, when we release something that once occupied space in our lives, what remains isn't always clarity. What often remains is silence. And silence is a strange place. At first, it can feel empty. After a relationship, silence. After a disappointment, silence. After a goodbye, silence. And that silence can feel uncomfortable. It can feel heavy. It can feel lonely. But what we often don't realize is that silence also holds enormous power, because silence is something that the noise never allows. It brings us back to ourselves. When the noise disappears, when we're no longer busy trying to hold together something that isn't working, something begins to appear, our inner voice. That voice we so often stop listening to while we're trying to meet expectations, maintain relationships, or simply survive difficult moments. And when we finally find ourselves in silence, that voice begins to wake up. So you know what to do. Get comfortable, grab your coffee, your cafecito, your glass of wine, or a cold beer, and get ready to chismear with me. So that is why there's a special reason this series begins in March. It's not a coincidence. March carries a very particular energy. March is that moment of the year when nature begins to remind us of something very important, that even after the coldest winters, life always finds a way to return. March marks the beginning of spring, and spring is not just the season of the year. Spring is a powerful metaphor for the cycles of life, because if we observe nature carefully, we see a truth. During winter, everything seems to stop. The trees lose their leaves, the flowers disappear, fields that were once full of color become quiet, the air grows cold, the branches look bare, the landscape changes completely. From the outside, it looks like everything has ended. It looks like life has withdrawn. It seems like what was once green and full of energy is now empty. But nature knows something that we often forget. Beneath the soil, life doesn't disappear. Under the surface, something is still happening. The roots are still there. The seeds are still there. The deeper layers of the earth are still holding life. Even if we can't see it, even if it is invisible, even if from the outside it looks like nothing is happening, life is still working in silence, still waiting, still preparing. Because nature is never in a rush. Nature understands timing. It understands that there are moments to grow, moments to bloom, moments to rest, and moments to rebuild internally before showing itself to the world again. And then March arrives. The day lasts a little longer, a ray of sunlight that stays just a bit more, a different breeze, a small green sprout appearing where there was once only soil. Small signs that something is waking up. And little by little, what seemed dead begins to grow. What seemed asleep begins to move. What seemed lost begins to open. Flower starts appearing again. Trees begin to regain their color. Landscapes fill with life once more. And what just weeks ago felt cold and silent is now full of movement. And the most interesting part of all of this is that none of that growth started the moment we saw it. The growth began much earlier. It began beneath the soil, it began in silence, and it began when no one was watching. And many times our emotional life works in exactly the same way. We also experience winters, moments when we feel like everything stopped, moments when something inside of us closed, moments when we feel tired, confused, or even lost. Moments when something that once mattered comes to an end, moments when a relationship changes, moments when a version of our life stops existing. And in those moments, it can feel as if everything was still, as if the world keeps moving forward, but we remain paused, as if everything we had emotionally built has lost its shape. And in the middle of that internal winter, many people begin to doubt themselves. They wonder if they will ever feel okay again. They wonder if they will ever trust again. They wonder if they will ever feel the same energy, the same excitement, the same openness toward life. But there is something very important I want you to hear, because this can change the way you see your own process. Just because something in your life is silent does not mean it's dead. Just because something paused does not mean it ended. Just because you're in the moment of stillness does not mean you lost your ability to grow. Many times it means the exact opposite. It means something inside you is reorganizing. Something inside you is rebuilding. Something inside you is taking the time it needs to heal, to understand, and to prepare for what comes next. Because real growth doesn't always happen in front of everyone. The deepest growth happens in those spaces where no one is watching. In those moments when you reflect, when you question things, when you decide you don't want to repeat the same patterns anymore, when you begin to listen to yourself with more honesty. And while all of that is happening, even if you don't see it, life continues, possibility continues, hope continues. Waiting for the exact moment when something inside of you makes a small movement. And it doesn't have to be something huge. Sometimes rebirth begins with something very simple, an internal decision. The decision not to give up on yourself. The decision to trust again little by little. The decision to open yourself to new possibilities. The decision to stand up again, even while you are still healing. Because many times that is what marks the beginning of a new spring in our lives. Not when everything is solved, not when everything is perfect, but when after everything we have lived through, we decide to keep growing. We decide to keep walking. We decide to believe again that something beautiful can still bloom in our lives. And maybe this moment in your life is exactly that. Maybe you're in that space between winter and spring. That moment when there is still silence, but something inside you has already started to awaken. That moment when you are still rebuilding, but you are no longer the same person you once were. That moment where the past still weighs a little, but the future is beginning to open. And if that is where you are today, then I want you to remember something. Spring never arrives all at once. It arrives little by little, but it always arrives. And when it does, everything that was growing in silence finally finds a way to bloom. So throughout this entire month, we're going to explore this process, not as something quick, not as something superficial, but as a path, a real process, human and deep. Week by week, episode by episode, little by little, we are going to step into those parts of our lives that we often keep silent. Those parts we rarely talk about with honesty. Those spaces where our doubts live, where our wounds live, but also where our strength lives. We're going to talk about how to reconnect with our voice, that inner voice we often stop listening to while we're trying to meet expectations, maintain relationships, or simply survive difficult moments. That voice that has always been there, but sometimes becomes buried beneath the noise of the world. We're going to explore how to hear it again, how to trust it again, how to allow it to guide us again. We will also talk about something many people feel but don't always know how to recover: our energy. Because when we go through difficult moments, when we carry too much for too long, when we live trying to hold everything together for everyone else, our energy begins to wear down. It becomes scattered, it becomes strained, it becomes exhausted. And many times we don't even realize how far we've drifted away from ourselves. So we're going to talk about how to recover that energy, how to refill those internal spaces, how to feel present in our own lives again. We will also explore something deeply important, something many of us were taught to ignore: our own needs. Because many people grew learning to take care of others first, to respond, to solve, to always be available. But very few of us were taught to pause and ask ourselves this: what do I need? What does my mind need? What does my heart need? What does my peace need? Learning to listen to our needs is not selfish. It is part of returning to ourselves. It is part of healing, and it's part of blooming. So we will also talk about something that can be very difficult but deeply liberating: boundaries. Boundaries are not walls. They are not punishments. They are not rejection. Boundaries are a form of self-love. They are the way we protect our energy, the way we protect our peace, and the way we honor what we feel and what we deserve. And learning to set boundaries, especially when we didn't do that before, can feel uncomfortable at first. I get that. But it can also become one of the most transformative acts we can make for our lives. Because when we begin to set boundaries with clarity, something inside of us becomes stronger. Our voice becomes stronger. Our dignity becomes stronger. Our relationship with ourselves becomes stronger. And that brings us to the heart of this entire process. Because at the end of the day, this series is about one very specific relationship, the most important relationship we will ever have in our lives: the relationship with ourselves, the relationship we have with our thoughts, with our emotions, with our story, with the person we are, and with the person we are learning to become. Because when that relationship becomes stronger, everything else begins to change. The way we love begins to change. No longer from need, no longer from fear, but from a place that is more conscious, more honest, and more whole. The way we choose begins to change. The people we allow into our lives, the opportunities we accept, the spaces where we decide to stay, and the places we learn to walk away from. The way we move through life begins to change. The way we face challenges, the way we protect our peace, the way we treat ourselves when we make mistakes or go through difficult moments. Because when we begin reconnecting with our essence, we begin to listening to ourselves with way more respect. When we begin building a stronger relationship with who we truly are, something very deep begins to shift inside of us. We start walking with more clarity, with more calm, with more strength, and not because life suddenly becomes perfect, but because we are no longer lost inside of it. We know who we are, we know what we feel, and we know what we deserve. And from that internal place of connection, something very powerful begins: the process of blooming from within. But before we continue moving forward, there is a question we need to face directly. And it may be a simple question: what does it truly mean to bloom? Because when we hear the word bloom, we often imagine something beautiful. We think about growth, we think about something new, we think about light. But we rarely talk about everything that happens before something blooms. Blooming is not just the moment when the flower appears. Blooming is the entire invisible process that happens before that moment. Blooming does not happen overnight. It does not happen because one day you decide to change and everything magically transforms. It does not happen because someone gives you the perfect piece of advice. And it does not happen because you read a book, you listen to a podcast, or make one quick decision. Blooming is much deeper than that. Blooming happens when something inside of you slowly begins to awaken. When you start reconnecting with parts of yourself that had fallen asleep. Parts of you that were always there, but that at some point you stopped listening to. Parts of you that maybe you learned to ignore. Maybe your intuition, that inner voice that spoke to you many times, but that over time you learned to silence. Maybe the part where you wanted to be creative. You wanted to explore, imagine, create, but that slowly moved into the background while you try to meet responsibilities, expectations, or simply survive difficult moments. Maybe your voice, your real voice, not the voice that says what others want to hear, but the voice that speaks what you truly feel, the voice that sets boundaries, the voice that says yes to what aligns with you, and also the voice that says no when something no longer feels right. Maybe what fell asleep were your boundaries, because many of us learn how to be strong, how to be responsible, how to take care of others, but we were never taught how to take care of ourselves. We were never taught that we also deserve space, that we also deserve rest, and that we also deserve to be heard. And so we spend years, sometimes even decades, living outward, fulfilling, solving, holding everything together, giving. And in the middle of all of that, something very quiet begins to happen inside of us. Something begins to pause, and it does not disappear, but it becomes silent. It waits, waiting for the moment when we finally turn inward again. Because many times life pushes us to survive first, to endure, to keep going even when we are tired, even when we are hurt, even when we feel like something inside of us has broken a little. And in those moments, it is normal for parts of our essence to fall asleep. Not because we lost them, but because they were waiting for the right moment to wake up. And that moment often comes after a rupture, after a loss, after a disappointment, after a deep change, after letting go of something that once occupied a large space in our life. Because when we let go, when we release what we can no longer continue, something opens, space opens, emotional space, mental space, internal space. And within that space, something begins to move. At first, it can be very gently. Maybe it begins as a question in your mind. Maybe it begins as a new feeling. Maybe it begins as a discomfort you cannot quite explain. But something inside of you begins to whisper, there is more for me, more life, more truth, more growth. And that is when the process of awakening begins. Slowly at first, because awakening does not always feel powerful. Sometimes awakening feels like doubt. Like questions, like moments of silence where you start noticing things you never saw before. And little by little, that awareness begins to grow. You begin to notice patterns. You begin to recognize what you no longer want to repeat. You begin to understand which parts of yourself you had left behind. And the more you listen to yourself, the stronger that inner voice becomes. The voice that reminds you of what you deserve. The voice that reminds you of your dignity, your value, your strength. And then a very powerful moment arrives. A moment that may seem small from the outside, but inside it changes everything. A moment where you realize something very profound. You are still here. After everything you have lived through, you are still here. After everything that hurt, you are still here. After everything you once believed you might not be able to overcome, you are still here. And not only are you still here, you still have the capacity to grow, the capacity to change, the capacity to rebuild yourself, the capacity to bloom. Because blooming does not mean there was never a winter. Blooming means that even after a winter, life finds its way back. And that is one of the most powerful things about being a human. Our ability to reborn, our ability to transform, our ability to open ourselves to life again, even after feeling like something inside of us had closed. That is blooming, not perfection, not control, not a life without pain. Blooming is something far more real. It is choosing to grow even after everything. It is choosing to listen to yourself even after spending a long time in silence. It is choosing to return to yourself. And when that happens, something incredible begins to unfold. Because when a person begins to bloom from within, their energy changes, their perspective changes, the way they walk through the world changes. They are no longer living only to survive. They begin living to be. And that is the beginning of something new. That is the beginning of rebirth. That is the beginning of blooming. But before we bloom, we have to begin to feel the energy of grow, of life, of expansion again. We have to learn something that many people find incredibly difficult. We have to learn how to listen to silence, because we live in a world filled with noise. Noise from opinions, noise from expectations, noise from what others believe we should be, should do, or should feel. And in the middle of all that noise, we often stop listening to ourselves. Distract ourselves. We stay busy. We fill our lives with work, activities, surface level conversation, social media, responsibilities. And not always because we truly need to, but because sometimes we are afraid to sit in silence with our own story. But silence carries a profound power. Silence confronts us. It shows us what we have been avoiding, and it reminds us of what we felt but never said. It brings us closer to the questions we have been trying to ignore for a long time. And even though it can feel uncomfortable, even though it can hurt, even though it can make us feel vulnerable, silence is also a space for healing. Because it is in the silence that we finally begin to truly hear ourselves, to listen to our intuition, that inner voice that often knows exactly how we feel and what we really want to say. To listen to our emotions, not to judge them, not to hide them, but to understand what they are really trying to tell us. To listen to our exhaustion, to listen to our wounds, to listen to our boundaries, to listen to our needs. Because many times we spend years living for other people, responding to what others expect from us, trying to be strong, responsible, available, understanding. And in that process, we forget to listen to ourselves. And that is why this moment, this space, is an invitation to truly pause, to breathe, to look inward with honesty, not with judgment, not with guilt, but with curiosity and with compassion. Because accepting our story does not mean becoming trapped in it. Accepting our story means recognizing everything we have lived through, everything we have felt, everything we have learned. And understanding that all of it is also part of who we are today, the bright parts and the parts that are still healing. Because silence is not emptiness. Silence is the place where emotions begin to find words, where wounds begin to understand, where decisions begin to take shape. It is the place where something new begins to be born. And that is why I want you to take a moment to listen and reflect on this phrase. What you kept silent, what you carried, what you let go of, is now the ground where you will bloom. Think about that for a moment. Everything you kept silent, the words you never said, the emotions you had to hold inside just to keep moving forward, everything you carried, the memories, the experiences, the lessons that maybe at that time you did not fully understand, and also everything you let go of, the people, the versions of your life that cannot continue, the expectations you had to release. None of it was in vain. None of it was simply lost, because every experience, every challenge, every difficult moment was preparing the soil where now you have the opportunity to grow in a different way, maybe more consciously, maybe stronger, maybe more connected to yourself. Everything you lived, everything that hurt, everything that forced you to rethink your path is not the end of your story. It was preparation. It was the root. It was the deep soil where something new, something more authentic, something more aligned to who you truly are is beginning to grow. And as always, I want to leave you with a book recommendation. It's called The Mountain Is You by Brianna Wiest. And this book speaks about something incredibly powerful. Many times the greatest obstacle we face in life isn't outside of us, it's within us. Our fears, our unhealed wounds, the stories we tell ourselves about what we deserve or what we believe we are capable of achieving. And it reminds us that the same person who built those walls also has the power to transform them. It's a book about self-awareness, emotional growth, and learning how to turn out your most difficult moment into opportunities for transformation. So that's why it connects so deeply with the theme of this episode. Because very often, the process of blooming begins exactly there, when we start to understand ourselves more deeply and stop fighting against ourselves. So if you are going through a season of change, healing, or rebuilding, this book might be a beautiful companion along the way. And remember this, what begins in silence often becomes a strength you didn't even know you had. So if today you are in silence, if today you feel like your life is on pause, if today you are rebuilding parts of yourself that broke along the way, if today you are trying to understand who you are after everything you lived through, I want you to remember something very important. Even when it doesn't seem like it, even when the process feels confusing, and even when pain makes us feel lost, you are not lost. You are in a process that many people go through, but that very few talk about honestly. You are in that moment in life when old things begin to fall away, when older versions of yourself no longer fit, when the questions appear before the answers, and that place can feel uncomfortable, I know. It can feel lonely. It can feel like you're walking without a map. But something deeply powerful is happening in that process. Because when life invites you to question everything, when it invites us to look inward, when it forces us to pause and rebuild, something new begins to form with us. A new clarity, a new way of understanding love, a new relationship with our own voice, a new way of walking through life. So if today you find yourself in that place, it doesn't mean you are lost. It means you're being reborn. And after being reborn is never a quick process.
And it is never a comfortable one either, but it's one of the most transformative processes we can experience because blooming doesn't happen overnight. Blooming is a whole entire process. In the description of this episode, you'll find the Amazon link with the full list of books mentioned in No Me Callo, I Won't Stay Quiet, from the very first episode until today. And don't forget that every Friday there's a new episode waiting for you as we continue our March series. Episode 2 is Roots of Your Power. Before we can truly bloom, we first need to look downward, toward our roots, because our roots don't just hold us up, they define us. They remind us of who we are, where we come from, and what has made us strong. In this episode, we will explore something deep. Your roots are your power, your values, your boundaries, your lessons, everything that has been the foundation of your life, even when you didn't recognize it. Because understanding your roots isn't just about looking at the past. It's about recognizing the strength that already lives within you. It's about accepting your story with everything that hurts, everything that teaches, and everything that has shaped you. It's about looking at something no one else can give you, your truth, your unique experience, the strength born from every fall and every time you stood back up. And here is a phrase I want you to stay with you as you listen to the second episode. You cannot grow without your roots, and your roots are something no one else can give you, and that includes your story, your strength, and your truth. Your truth is not anyone else's. Your strength cannot be compared to someone else's. Your story is yours, and it is from there that the real growth begins. And if you have ever felt disconnected from yourself, if you have ever wondered how to keep moving forward without losing who you are, then this episode is for you. Get ready to look inward, reconnect with your essence, and feel how when your roots grow stronger, your power begins to bloom from within. So don't miss it. You were listening to No Me Callo, I Won't Stay Quiet. I'm your host, Jessica Lomelin. Until next time.